The Dog Door by Megan Shortley. After my son was born, my then husband and I bought a 100-year-old house for our expanding family, which included the three of us and our medium-large dog. As someone who grew up afraid of the dark, after a strange incident with a neighbor boy looking in my windows as a child, I repeatedly had to tell myself that the creaks and thumps and sounds were normal for a house of that age, with old growth trees that bumped the roof and scraped the windows at night, and noisy radiant heat and a back gate that wouldn't stay shut and clanked in the wind. I'd hear something, and instead of investigating, I'd hide under the covers like any reasonable adult. When my then husband and I split up, I kept the creaky house, and he kept the medium-large dog. When my son was still small, the two of us were watching a movie in the front room around dusk when my phone died. As a Type B personality, the one charger I had was typically strewn somewhere about the house. This time I found it in the kitchen. But as I crossed to the counter to plug it in, I had the overwhelming, goose-bumpy, tingly sinking sense that something was very, very wrong. I turned and I realized that not only was the back gate open again, someone was sitting cross-legged in the yard, seemingly staring at the house. They had a hood and dark sunglasses, despite the fleeting light, and didn't move even when I stepped closer to the window to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. They remained eerily motionless when I was certain they could see me, and still, even when I was pretty sure they could see that I had seen them. I quickly locked the back door, grabbed my phone and my charger, and headed into the dining room to my laptop, where I sent the first person I could see online a message that someone was sitting in my yard, staring at my house, and that my phone was dead, and to please call the police if they didn't hear from me in a few minutes. I assumed whoever was in the yard would leave once sighted, but nevertheless waited on tenterhooks, impatiently staring at my still useless phone. After an awkward conversation with my son about why we weren't going to the kitchen to get a glass of water, it finally lit up and I was able to call 911. I tried to calmly explain to the dispatcher that I was sure the person was gone, but begged that they please send an officer to check my yard, as the motionless staring was unsettling at best. Keeping me on the phone, she asked if I could look out a window without being seen to verify, as well as check the locked door. I awkwardly crept as stealthily as I could toward the kitchen, slowly realizing that while the back door was locked, it also had a very clearly too large dog door with no functioning way to block it. Panicking, I stood slightly in an attempt to scan the yard and came face to face with a hood and sunglasses staring down at me through the window. At this point, I was incoherent as the dispatcher urged me to grab my son and hightail it to a locked room. I dart back to him and explain we need to go now, and as I pick him up, I hear the clear and unmistakable sound of the dog door slowly swinging open. I abandoned the house, leaving the front door wide open, and dashed across the street to pound on my neighbor's door. Once inside, they kindly paused their dinner party to distract my son while I stared across the street and messily sobbed about our very indoor cat we left behind. Not long after the officers arrived, they came through the side gate with hood and sunglasses in tow. They'd apprehended her calmly sitting on my back step, her arm lazily, purposefully swinging in and out of the dog door. I boarded the dog door shut that night, but we moved shortly thereafter, as I was never quite sure, After that, if all the nighttime knocks and bumps and open gates I'd been hearing were actually just the old house. Just Up the Stairs by What's Her Name. Back in the late 2000s, I was in my early 20s and living happily for a few years as a broke expat in Berlin. One of my roommates, who was from the UK, and I were out late-ish seeing a band play, maybe around midnight or 1 a.m. And afterwards, we were headed home, walking through a relatively central but quiet part of the city towards a subway station entrance. We were in high spirits after a couple drinks and a fun night out. Not too drunk, just a little tipsy, and we were laughing and chatting, probably somewhat loudly, as we headed arm in arm towards the subway entrance, which was ahead of us, down at the far end of a long, quiet street. It was late October, early November, and still warm enough for it to feel nice to walk outside, and the misty air hung in yellow halos under the streetlights. Just as a little gust of wind blew some leaves across the pavement in front of us, we both became aware of a figure walking ahead of us in the mist. From the back, it appeared to be an older woman, stooped over, carrying bags in each hand, and walking with a very pronounced limp, sort of dragging one of her legs along behind her. We were speaking English and nearly about to pass around her on the sidewalk when the woman cried out, rather exaggeratedly, in English but with a thick German accent, "Oh, help! Won't somebody help me?" She didn't sound frightened or worried so much as deeply demanding, and her tone of voice suggested she expected to be helped. My roommate tried to keep us moving ahead past her, but I softened and slowed down my pace, because after all, this was an elderly woman carrying bags late at night, and she clearly couldn't walk very well. I asked her what she needed help with, and she said, "It's my leg. Help me carry the bags. I live just over there." And she nodded towards an apartment building entryway, a half a block up the street. My inner Good Samaritan instincts kicked in, and I responded automatically, "Oh, of course we'll help you." My roommate seemed decidedly less enthused for some reason, but begrudgingly followed me as we each grabbed one of the woman's bags and carted them to the doorstep up the street. As the woman's face came into sharper relief underneath a nearby streetlight, I realized that she looked exactly like a witch out of a German fairy tale. Bent posture, a large wart on her nose, grayish-white straggly hair, and she was wearing dark wool clothing with a hood. I was honestly taken aback by her appearance and nearly gasped out loud. But again, wanting to be polite, I pushed this to the back of my mind. Who cares what she looks like, I told myself. She's just an elderly lady who needs our help. When we arrived at her building's doorstep, the entryway door was surprisingly ajar, not the norm at all in the neighborhood we were in, and she pushed it open easily, suddenly seeming to possess more strength than she had had moments before, and leaned forward to hold it for open me so that I could go in first, and she would be behind me. She gestured up a dark and dingy flight of stairs and breathed, "Just up the stairs, just up the stairs." I froze in my tracks for a second in the doorway, as my tipsy 23-year-old brain tried to puzzle it out. Logically, the polite thing to do would be to carry the bag up the stairs for this woman, right? But then again, all the hairs were standing up on the back of my neck, and the building's hallway and narrow staircase, in the dim fluorescent yellow light, looked awfully foreboding. I could just make out a doorway at the top of the stairs on the right-hand side There was also slightly ajar, leading into an apartment. An air of intensely stale, musty smoke wafted down the stairs. And then there was the tone of stark urgency in the woman's voice as she urged me to step fully inside and get up the stairs as quickly as possible. If I had to describe her tone, it wasn't too far from the voice of a cartoon villain rubbing their hands together while hatching a nefarious plan. As I stood in the entryway, tipsily trying to weigh the very bad feeling in the pit of my stomach against my lifelong fear of being impolite, I actually giggled at how absurdly horror movie-esque the moment felt. So much so that it couldn't be a real threat, right? It was too spot on, so I must be imagining it. Fortunately, my roommate, who had seen more shit in her life than I had at that point, literally yelled out, "Oh, hell no," hooked her arm into mine, and pulled me out the door and down the street as quickly as possible. The old woman yelled disappointedly after us as my roommate whisked me across the street and down the subway stairs, back into the safety of a warm, brightly lit public space full of people. Once we had safely escaped, my roommate shared the two things that had set off definitive alarm bells in her head. One, she was certain that the woman's limp wasn't there initially as she walked ahead of us, and that it had only appeared later. Just Doing Its Job by Jen Yurdy. This was a decade ago now, at a very difficult time in my life. I had moved to Northern California from the Pacific Northwest for grad school, living in a shitty studio provided by the school with too much stuff in it. No real chance to make friends yet. Unemployed for the first time in my adult life, living off what I could scrounge from odd jobs. I had acute PTSD that I believed at that time was going to kill me. I had been suicidal for years before this, and that made it worse. On the afternoon this happened, I was laying in my bed on my side, facing away from the wall, with the one window above my head. California sunshine, sounds of campus outside. I was drifting in and out of a nap when the previously warm and brightly lit room went cool, silent, and dark. Weird, but maybe a lull in traffic, a cloud over the late afternoon sun. But soon I felt more, then saw a black shadow behind me. Almost as soon as I sensed the being, I don't know what else to call it, I felt it try to enter me and felt the most pain I've ever experienced. This wasn't sexual at all. Instead, it felt like the black shadow was trying to float into my body, to possess it, or just to satisfy its curiosity. I have no idea. But it hurt so badly, like every cell on my body was on fire. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't think I could face what I'd see, and I didn't know anything else I could do to stop it, because it felt imperative to stop it. My whole body was screaming. I could even feel my face form a scream, but nothing came out. The only thing I could think of to do was to just tighten every bone, muscle, tendon, cell in my body and try to force it out, or at least stop its progress. So that's what I did, and it kind of worked. At least that pushing through feeling stopped for a second. It started up again, and I tightened even further, my body in so much pain from the intrusion that the tightening was almost a relief. And it stopped again. I became aware that I had a sense of a silent emotional response from the being as I relaxed a bit and it attempted to intrude once more, but more tentatively this time. I tightened once again, and I felt this sense of confusion from the being as they withdrew their hand, body, from mine. They were genuinely confused and somewhat concerned about why I was doing this, why I wasn't allowing them in. Something wasn't going according to what they had planned or expected. I saw a shadowy part of them pass over me out of the corner of my eye. They seemed to be moving over my body, checking it out. I could feel their presence above my skin and get a sense of the size of them. They were just this cloud of black, darker in some parts, but almost see-through in others. They tried one last time. Just a tendril. But I knew what worked at this point, and tightened again, and the being withdrew their tendril and disappeared. The room was suddenly light again. I could hear sound outside just like before. But I still didn't dare move for quite some time after, terrified it would come back. It never did. But I still didn't sleep for weeks. I still struggled to lay down for a nap. What if it comes back? I don't know what it was or what it wanted. I spent many of those sleepless nights searching online, but got nowhere. It's honestly hard to get good results when you Google, "Dark shadowy thing tried to enter me, alien ghost," as it turns out. It seemed like most people would think it was sleep paralysis or hypnagogic hallucinations, but I've read about all of those, and it doesn't fit what I felt. I could move enough to tighten. I could feel my face make expressions. I could move my eyes, and I could feel its emotions, which felt very simple, with no malice at all, like it didn't want to hurt me, and it was really puzzled that it realized or suspected it had. It seemed like the being expected me to be asleep or, and this is what it really felt like, dead. I don't know if one of my suicide attempts that year wasn't supposed to have been survived, and I got on some sort of list, but got spared somehow. Or maybe someone, a few apartments over, was a few minutes late to their final exit because their ride was delayed by me. Or if it was an alien of some kind, it definitely did not feel human in any way. I truly hope I'll never meet it again until it's my time to go. But I honestly wish it well. It scared the absolute crap out of me, but I really don't think it meant to. Its actions, whatever they were meant to do, felt remarkably simple and neutral, like it was just doing a job and corrected its mistake when it realized it. The job was just possession. "4 years ago, my husband and I took an anniversary trip to the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. It was early-ish pandemic days, and the opportunity to be free of the tornado of constant home work, parenting, a toddler, was as great as the lakes we'd hoped to explore. We split the trip into 2 parts, one part outdoorsy, one part relaxation. We started out kayak camping on Lake Superior, just off Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. We had a remote campsite out on Grand Island that we would paddle to in our sport level, inflatable kayak, carrying all our food and gear for 2 nights. The paddle to the campsite had been challenging, but doable. We were medium-level kayakers, so after about 3 hours of travel with some poking around the island mixed in, we were very ready to settle in. The campsite itself was stunning. It faced a large bay that then opened out onto Lake Superior, beautifully framing the horizon in a way that felt almost fake. Off in the distance, you could barely make out the edge of Pictured Rocks. The wolves howled and laughed throughout the night as we sat around the fire, the woods around us lit only by glow lichen. After a beautiful first night, we woke up with the shining sun to enjoy the view, shake off the boxed wine hangover, and drink coffee before heading out to adventure. We made a loose plan to kayak towards Pictured Rocks, which involved a short open water crossing that was potentially treacherous, but worth it to get to where we wanted to go. To our surprise, we nailed the open water crossing in a little over an hour. It was challenging, but the famous Lake Superior waves proved manageable, and our arms withstood the power of the current. We spent the rest of the day poking along the coastline, taking in the breathtaking rock formations and arches soaking up the sunshine, and stopping at various beaches for exploration and snacks. At around 3 p.m., we decided to head back to the campsite to get settled in for the evening. As we stood on the beach, plotting our way back, we noticed that the rental kayak bros were busy hauling all the kayaks up to a shelter. We figured, since it was late September, they were likely closing early due to a light end-of-season day. The tourists had also slowly trickled away, and we were left mostly alone. There were 2 options for heading back. The first was to go back the way we came along the coastline, and then repeating the same open water crossing we had done that morning. This would also take us against the current, meaning we'd be working a lot harder and adding time when we didn't necessarily have the daylight to spare. The second option was to take a straight line through a much larger open water crossing back to the island, which we could see plain as day ahead of us. It would be a much shorter and direct route. In our eagerness to get back to camp and still feeling ourselves over how well we'd been doing, we chose option 2. We started out and were feeling strong as we paddled along. The waves were picking up a bit, but that was to be expected once we got to the open water. We took a quick break and finished up the last of our snacks, confident that we would be back to camp in an hour or 2 to refuel our bodies. We'd been at it for probably an hour, and the weather was turning. The sun disappeared, and the clouds began to spit rain. Or was that mist from the waves that were gradually splashing higher and higher around us? The wind had picked up to a steady clip right into our faces. The water was cold. I can't pinpoint exactly when I realized we weren't moving forward anymore, but I remember looking over at the rocky coastline far to my left and realizing the particular rock that I had been tracking for a while had not moved even a little. It was still in the same spot it had been the last time I looked at it and the time before. We were silent, neither of our stubborn asses ready to admit that we may have gotten in way over our heads. We plowed on. Another hour passed. Or was it 2? The minutes really did turn into hours as we kept paddling and paddling forward and getting seemingly nowhere. I was positioned in the front of the kayak, trying to keep us moving as much as I could. But the wind had other ideas. I scanned every direction, and there was nowhere to go that would allow for a safe landing. There was a rock wall on one side and thick brush on the other, both options very far in the distance. There was not another boat in sight. My husband pulled out his phone, but had absolutely no signal. We kept paddling. My husband was in the back, working his hardest to steer us in a straight line. At one point, he shouted to me over the din of wind and spray, "Give me your water bottle." I obliged without question, and turned enough to see him open it up and dump its contents into the lake. "What the fuck are you doing?" I screamed, my survivalist instinct to ration our water having kicked in somewhere along the line. I then saw why. He